Hello and welcome to AXSChat. This week we are talking about accessibility in games, and not just computer games either. Actually, we've got Michael Heron, who is a lecturer at the School of Computing Science and Digital Media at Robert Gordon University in Scotland. But his specialism, and he tweets under the name of Meeple Like Us, is in board games accessibility and also in the accessibility of sort of games in niche concepts, etc., and contexts. So welcome, Michael. It's really great to have you with us. It's a really interesting new angle for us to cover on the chat. It's not something we've covered before. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you do and how you came to be interested in accessibility in gaming, and then in particular in board games, and what that actually means?
Yeah, so thanks very much. It's fantastic to be here. So what I mostly spend my time doing is playing games and then trying to pretend there's some kind of research angle to it. And it's been largely a case of sort of justifying what has become it's not so much a research interest as it is a research obsession. I started playing these things I got some money at Christmas. Somebody gave me a Christmas present. I thought, I'm going to buy some games. We'll see what they're like. Sat down with them and I thought, oh, so this is where all the innovation in gaming has moved to. Because for the past few years, it hasn't been a hugely interesting gaming landscape outside of indie titles. And it turns out they're all in these boxes. That's where all the clever ideas are. So I started buying more, playing more, and eventually got to the point that I was doing this so often, I thought there must be something beyond what I'm currently getting just in the games for this, because these are such fantastically interesting and intricate experiences that it seems like there's probably a lot of accessibility stuff that I could possibly start looking into. So I started a blog called Meeple Like Us, and I wrote up what I refer to as an accessibility teardown. This is what it's like to play this game. This is what you need to be able to do from a visual processing stance. This is what the cognitive requirements are. This is what you need to do physically to interact with the game. And also into that, I layered on some more holistic aspects of accessibility, like what happens if you play with somebody who's a bad loser or somebody who has emotional control considerations? Is this a game you maybe want to sit down with them, or is it something you maybe want to pass by? And as part of a wider aspect of accessibility, I also like to think about sociological and economic aspects like business models and representation and inclusion, all these different kinds of things. So all the games that I play, basically, I just sit down, play them a few times, and then write one of these documents that assesses and analyzes all the different accessibility angles for it. And that's primarily what the site is about, just trying to help people who have various kinds of disabilities or temporary impairments find games that would actually work for them. And it's been going on for maybe a year and a half now. We've looked at not nearly enough games, but about 150 of them in total. And we've sort of mapped out where all the trouble points are in those games, where the games that people would actually be able to play, and sort of started to systemize how we'd actually analyze this kind of thing. So yeah, it's just an interest that's become an obsession, and that obsession has got its output in a research adjacent blog that seems to be relatively popular.
Excellent. And obviously these kind of games, they're mainly board games. Mm-hmm. Although the types of games, the types of physical interactions you're going to have are going to be different. A lot of them involve cards, but there's also sort of small pieces. And I have to admit, I haven't played board games for a long time, but I used to play a couple obsessively. I used to play Risk an awful lot.
Yeah.
And also cheat horribly at Monopoly. Yeah. So
well, the thing that makes this such a fascinating accessibility domain is that there is no common interface to a board game. So it's not like you sit down at a computer, you've got your keyboard, your mouse, your monitor, and you can rely on that as a certain degree of consistency. It's not even like video games where you've got different kinds of controllers and you've got different platforms like Switch, motion control, and all these different kinds of things. There is zero consistency in a board game. So you might end up with a deck of cards for one, you might end up with another one that is purely verbal. You might end up with one where your job is to convince other people that other people are lying, and so you're sort of desperately trying to talk over people rather than give them a chance to make their points. There are some games, for example, that are just, all you've got is like a plastic cup and an auctioneer's paddle, and your job is to get people to bid on things by giving them a count as fast or as slow as you want to do. So sometimes it's even just, how do you actually handle the communication around the game that makes it distinctive? So every single game is its own unique accessibility puzzle. And that's, I think, where the obsession for this has come from. It's just phenomenal just how different these games are. And there's this massive renaissance that's happening in board games. The market has grown 10, 20, sometimes 30% on a year-by-year basis. And it's getting to the point now that it's starting to break into the mainstream. But even with all that taken into account, it's still very much a niche hobby, and very few people have been looking at the accessibility of it in any kind of systematic way. I mean, I'm by far not the first person to talk about it, but maybe the first person to be quite so systematic about sort of examining all these different kinds of areas.
That's fascinating, and I wonder what the drivers are for the uptake in board games. Do you think that some of this is essentially the need to do the digital detox?
Yeah.
Where everybody's sat staring at screens, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 screens at a time, doing multiple things at once, and then actually sitting down with people playing a physical game with no digital inputs. It has a different kind of experience and brings people together in a different way.
I think maybe 20 or 30 years ago, when people played games, often they played them as a social experience. They used to have what was called couch co-op. And that was a case of, you'd sit with your friend or your relatives or whatever on the same the same room. You'd have your different controllers, you'd have a split screen thing, and you'd be playing those games together. But now, if you want to play multiplayer games, essentially what you're doing is you are mediated through the internet. You're often connected to maybe people you know in other countries, but often strangers, random people on the internet. And it's not quite as social, and it's not quite as intimate. So when that becomes a thing that people think, I really want to get back to this idea of just sitting down with people and having fun with them, board games are a fantastic focal point for that. We have, I think, an issue. Certainly in Britain, we have a kind of issue where it's difficult to say to people, I want to spend some time with you. That the very starkness of that, you go up to somebody and say, I'd like to spend some time with you this evening. And people get a bit, oh, what? That's kind of weird. So we say things like, do you want to go to the pub? And, with all the attendant issues that come with that. But in some countries, what they do is say, I'd like to spend some time with you. Let's play a board game. And as time gets by, anybody who becomes a fan of these things is almost by nature going to be a proselyte for it. You're going to agitate for it because you need more people to play games. So people become evangelists for this in a way that they don't for video games, because they still tend to be quite solitary experiences. At least that's my theory on why these are becoming quite so popular.
I also have a theory, just from a different perspective. I have right now, I have a small family. I have a son and a daughter. My son has moved out, but my daughter, and we've talked about it on the show before, but my daughter was born with Down syndrome, and then my husband of almost 36 years has been diagnosed with dementia. And so what we've actually been doing, as Neil said, is some of it is about the digital detox, but we're finding that it allows us to be more engaged with each other if we are playing these games. And so I went out at Christmas time, and I bought a whole bunch of different games. And we were talking about this before we started the show, but one of the games that I bought, and it's a real popular game, I think worldwide, but it's called, I believe, Apples to Apples. And I love this game because what's interesting about it, in the first place, it's easy to use, which is very important right now for my husband and my daughter. But I love that, depending upon who the judge is. So I don't know if if everybody knows Apples to Apples, but it's, it can be as complicated as you want it to be. But depending upon who the judge is, it changes the dynamics of the game. So what I have found is that it is allowing me to try to understand how my husband is thinking versus how my daughter's thinking. And we engage with each other in ways that we are not doing when we're just having conversations or if we're watching television together. I wonder if more families and more individuals are playing games for reasons like that, because there's like cognitive reasons why we're playing these games and psychological reasons. And also, as I give you one more thing to answer too, I find that some of the games that I've bought, they're supposed to be very simple games, 4 years old and up. And I find they're some of the most confusing and complicated games that we can't play them because of the different ways we're each using our brains. So
that is
throwing a lot at you.
One of the more interesting things I think I've found with the site is that some of the simplest games are the ones I would consider to be the most cognitively inaccessible, because I think it's because sometimes if you've got a very simple rule set, you want to try and make that rule set as complex in terms of how you use it as possible. So there's a game called Once Upon a Time. I absolutely love this game. So it's a storytelling game where you get a handful of narrative beats saying things like, fairy tale or well or dragon or all these different kinds of things. And what your job is to tell a fairy story using those cards. And if you ever see something in your story that somebody else has matching in their card, they can play down theirs and take control of the story. And you can get the rules of that 10, 15 seconds. It's not complicated in terms of how the rules work. But cognitively, that's an incredibly difficult thing to ask people to do, because they have to be creative. They have to be listening to stories. They sometimes have to be dealing with 3 or 4 narratives at a time as people swap between them. And while these things seem like they're very simple in terms of the rules are just a part of it. I mean, we talked earlier about this idea of not playing the game, but playing the people. And when you're dealing with the psychology of how people actually react in social games, that's as difficult in a game as in any other kind of circumstance. It's being able to read and infer and know the kind of directions things are going to take and anticipate where people are likely to be moving their stories and their strategies in different kinds of games. So it's really very cognitively difficult to do those kind of things. So when you look at the rule sets, the age recommendations are often for how difficult the rules are, but they're not usually for how difficult the thinking is. And that sort of disconnect is something that we've been exploring with the site, because it's often the case that games that seem incredibly simple are the ones I would be least likely to recommend for anybody who is looking for an accessible game.
Wow. I'm going to get that game Once Upon a Time.
It's a fantastic game. It's a superb game.
And I know that in the United States, a lot of people are feeling so disconnected from each other. And so I imagine some of that disconnection is what's causing us to go back to these board games. And now I'm talking too much. I'm going to turn the mic over to Antonio, but what an amazing topic. Thank you, Neil, for inviting him.
Thank you, Darren. No, I can say that I spend most of my time in Cork City in the south of Ireland. And I noticed that in the last 5 years, there's a good number of clubs focused on board games in the city where people meet. They just go there for a cup of coffee. And people get curious about what's going on in that place. And what I would like to ask is, if you look at how board games and this dynamic of the example that I was just providing about the places where people go to socialize, if you look how do you see board games as a way to break isolation and a way for people to engage with others, focus on something that they like, at the same time that get out of their homes where sometimes they used to play only by themselves?
Yeah, there's sort of 2 interesting angles there, in that if you sit down with somebody and play a game, it sort of solves a lot of the social dynamic problems, because you don't have to be clever or interesting. You can just focus on the game. And clever and interesting can come later when you're feeling a bit more comfortable. But this is also a hobby where there's a certain degree of bravery that you need when you go into these kind of circumstances, to just come up to a group of people and say, I would like to play the game that you're playing. And that requires a considerable amount of social confidence that's not always present in the people who, at least historically, have been very heavily invested in these kind of games. So I mean, I'm a hardcore introvert. I find it very hard to be around large crowds of people. And despite the fact I teach for a living and have to basically talk to people constantly on a day-by-day basis, I find it very difficult just to go up to a stranger and say, let's play this game. So there is this sort of this two-factor thing in that people who have a certain degree of confidence will sit down and they'll find this is an easy way to make friends. But people who are socially isolated and find that one of the reasons for that social isolation is a lack of confidence can find that that initial barrier is very difficult to break. But once you break it, you have this connection to people, and you have this ability to then you have this great, fantastic thing where you can be the one who invites other people in to break the the confidence trap for them. So it's a complicated, difficult kind of thing. It's fine if you have a group of people who are willing to play, but it's much more difficult if you're trying to then find people to play games with. But there is a sort of common saying in board game, which is it's easier to make friends of board gamers than it is to turn friends into board gamers. You find people who are already interested and you become friends with those, and the hobby is fantastic for that. Just it does require a little bit of confidence, at least to begin with, until you have a social circle that's building around the hobby.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Antonio, did you want to follow up?
Yes, please. And do you see, in terms, even in terms of financially, do you see board games as something that is also more accessible for people to participate than just the online and side of things?
Yeah, there is a problem, and the problem is that board gaming is largely a luxury hobby. I have hundreds of games there, and most of them are maybe 30 or 40 pounds. So that is for one single game. That is a huge amount of money for somebody to drop on something if they have, for example, income issues that they worry about. You can't just say, here's a great game you should play if that game happens to be, £50. I have a game sitting there, I've £120 it costs. It's currently the number one game on a site called Board Game Geek, which is like the big database of the hobby. But that's £120 for the world's best game. And if you look at the hobby and you come and sit and look at the site and say, this is a hobby, I'm priced out of this hobby, I can't possibly do this. And there's also a sort of a culture around this of, I sort of love and hate this word, shelfies, which is the idea of you take a photograph of your collection so people can see the games that you've got. And often these collections, I mean, this is largely as a propaganda. It's an inaccessible collection. People look at that and think, that's so many games, I can't possibly buy that many games. Maybe this isn't a hobby for me. So wall to wall, the kind of cost in this hobby is an issue. And there are certain business models that go into this, the games, that are especially bad for that. Have you ever heard of a game called Magic the Gathering? It's what's called a collectible card game. And you'd buy what are called booster packs, and they would have a random collection of cards in them. It's not quite as bad now as it was maybe 10 or so years ago. But if that booster pack didn't have the card you wanted, you either had to go source that card on eBay or something, or you had to buy booster packs until you found it. And that's a borderline exploitative way of getting people to participate in a game economy. It was obviously incredibly profitable. But, there's all these stories of like kids who are stealing money out of their parents' wallets and things just so they were able to get these kind of booster packs. Those kind of games have fallen out of fashion, but there are other games that work on this idea of a constant cycle of expansions or new content or just influxes of new kinds of parts of the game. So, yeah, I mean, the business models that go into these, you have to be wary when you look at the game. Are you buying a game or are you buying an obligation to continue to participate in the economic cycle of it? And that's one of the things that we look at on the site as well. There's a number of games that have been fantastic, but I wouldn't recommend to people just because the expectation is you've bought this thing here, but you need to buy every month £20 worth of stuff just to keep up.
Which is an interesting business model, but I remember my son was into that, and it was like you said, it gets very expensive, and then it prices a lot of people out. I once again am so fascinated by this topic, and to be honest, I've never thought about this topic from the perspective of accessibility, which makes me feel bad, but I just never thought about it. And so I was looking on your Twitter feed, and I saw, there were some people that were showing games where the lighting is off, or the text is so small. I mean, you can't even begin to see it. And I know, once again, as we are playing games in my family to stay connected and to cognitively challenge our brains. But I wonder if, as I know, once again, speaking from a US lens, a lot of people are feeling very isolated. I know it's not just in the US, that's all over the world, but a lot of people are feeling very isolated. And lonely, and that's not just people with disabilities, but certainly it is impacting people with disabilities. But I wonder if with the surge and the way people are buying games and stuff, is this allowing generations to come together more? Because I am one of those baby boomer generations, and the baby boomers are all over the world. I hear it talked about. But I wonder if this is the way that we go back and start engaging with each other through multi-generations. And like you said, I love the example that you gave, is that it would be intimidating to walk into a pub or wherever, and people are playing a game and they look like they're having a blast, but I think I might be intimidated to say, hey, I want to play. So I think it really ties into social isolation and who we are as individuals. And that must partially be why there's such a resurgence of it happening. But I'm curious about the generational thing too.
I think the generational thing is a fantastic point, because there's a sort of hook there that you don't necessarily have with, for example, video games. Now, when I was younger, my father was a computer guy, so we would play games together. But the idea that most people, like, for example, your grandparents probably didn't play these kind of games, but they will have played board games. Maybe not these ones here, but they will have played board games. So there's something that there's a sort of a continuity of tradition that extends through the generations in that kind of sense. That if you are sitting down, it's just a different kind of thing than that you've already done. It's not Monopoly, but it's a game that you will find as or more interesting, and it is still just a board game. So you often find that people who play these kind of games often play them with younger relatives or older relatives. I mean, I play these games with my mother all the time, and she loves them and regularly beats me at them because just that's what happens. And one of the other things that's sort of really useful, sort of harking back to this idea of the economic accessibility, one of the best things about the hobby at the moment is that a lot of organizations like libraries and such are starting to look at how you actually lend games out or how you make them available in the library. And that has this fantastic aspect that makes it an affordable hobby, in that you don't have to actually buy the games or find people to play them. The library is your facilitator of this. And that deals with all kinds of issues of social isolation as well, because people are often familiar with their library, and going into a library doesn't necessarily take the same kind of social courage as going up to people at a games cafe or in a game shop. You go into the library and there's a different kind of expectation as to what the interactions tend to be. So the more that these games kind of become normalized, and the more that they become in familiar environments, the more likely it is that you are going to find even just strangers, not just playing with your older relatives or your younger relatives, just playing cross-generational with people, just because institutions such as libraries are inherently cross-generational.
I think that's fascinating. And I think that some of the stuff you've been talking about the sort of whole subscription model, getting on the train of having to pay is a different kind of inaccessibility. It's the financial inaccessibility, but equally the people that are least likely to have the financial wherewithal to pay for all of this are likely to be people with disabilities, people who are socially excluded already. So putting this stuff, putting games into libraries is really important. I think one of the things that has happened over the last few years with digital games has been the freemium model. So yes, they do monetize the heck out of of the products, but it is possible to play for free. You don't, you're never going to be top of the leaderboard, but you can still enjoy and participate. And some of these games that you play them on your mobile phone, so you don't need to buy extra kit. You're not splashing out on the Xbox One and your monthly subscriptions to all of the various different other things that come with that. And I think that what I have seen is that you do create online communities. I ran a clan, and people did care for each other, but it is different. It's not. You haven't got that same kind of physical closeness and the proximity, and you do get side banter, but it's more internet chat room side banter than the sort of the gentle conversation that you're having whilst stealing someone's income on Monopoly, or invading Kamchatka in Risk. So I think that there's different dynamics going on, and I think it's really important that stuff is available that's affordable, and if people want to pay for it, that's absolutely their choice. But we've seen this monetization sort of serialization model that's been going on since Victorian times, right?
Exactly.
But I once worked I actually worked for a company that sold memorabilia, sci-fi memorabilia, and we used to see the Trekkies and the Star Wars fans being exploited horribly, because like your wall there, they would release a set of videos with a spine image, so people would collect the whole thing, and they'd finish collecting it, and then they would re-release the videos with a different spine image with a different number of episodes per video, and they'd buy the whole lot all over again.
There for the grace of God. I remember very much being a Star Trek fan, and if I had the money, I would have done all those things.
Yeah, people just get bought into it. Deborah, I think you've got a question, have you?
Well, I once again, I think it's such a fascinating conversation, and you were saying, Michael, that there's, how do you make sure that people that create board games are considering accessibility, are considering multi-generational needs and things like that? And I was just curious, how do you do that, Michael? I mean, how do you even begin? I've just never thought about it.
Well, the problem is that this is a hobby that's been kind of insular for quite some time. So maybe 5 or so years ago, there were only, 15 or so years ago, there was only a handful of people who actually were keeping this hobby alive as an actual going concern. And as it's become bigger and bigger and bigger, it's become more that the kind of standard expectations that people have of commercial and entertainment products are starting to be retrofitted into this. So, video games are now better for accessibility than they were, and they're becoming reasonably good. And that people like Ian Hamilton and such, who have done fantastic work in making it so that we know how to make accessible video games now. The fight is getting people to actually do it. For board games, we don't even know how to make them accessible. And for the 150 or so games that we've looked at on the site, there are some guidelines that we're putting together, and there's like quite a large working group of people who are trying to put together some useful guidelines for this. But every single game has its own nuances and complexities. And for a lot of it, it's just a case of getting people to be a bit more empathic about who is likely to be playing these kind of games. So it doesn't take a lot to make a game colorblind accessible, for example. Just don't have colors your only channel of information. Just double code it in some kind of way. But even in 2018, we find games from quite large publishers that still aren't doing that. And it's not because they don't know how to do it. It's just because they haven't thought about it, or sometimes it's the case there's sort of aesthetic concerns that they're considering, or there are a handful of games I've found where I've thought to myself, yeah, that one would have been quite tough because, for example, translucent dice or something. But a lot of it's just a case of people aren't really considering that this is a hobby for people with disabilities, because up until now, that hasn't actually been the case. And my view is that this is a hobby that is I would tentatively recommend it to people who have disabilities on a sort of case-by-case basis. But there's no reason that the massive group of people who have disabilities can't be almost fully integrated into this hobby. Maybe not playing every game, because sometimes the inaccessibility is where the fun is. But everybody should have a large range of fantastic games they can play. And that's kind of true, but it could be better, because almost every game you think of, yeah, there's things that you could do there. So mostly what I do with that is I make sure any game I do a teardown for, I will tag the publisher in so that they know that this is a document that they have available. I will contact publishers directly and say, hey, this is a thing that I'm doing, these particular games of yours, I'd be interested in having a look at those. Sometimes publishers will send me those games for that, or occasionally I just radio silence on the other end, because it's not a topic people are usually comfortable with. But it's on a good day, I'd say it's getting better. On a bad day, I'd say there's just so many games coming out that you can't possibly make a dent in it. But I think by and large, progress is being made. It's just slower than I would like. But one of the things I take heart from is we know what this is like, because this is what video games were like,
Yes.
10, 15 years ago. If you raised the topic of accessibility 10 or 15 years in video games, you would have, an online riot on your hands, because people didn't think that was a thing to worry about. And now you still get, for board games, get people saying, I don't see why we should be concerned about accessibility for people with disabilities, because, nobody I know, or I don't think there's a big market for this. But again, 10, 15 years ago, that's exactly what it was for video games. So there's reason to have hope that this is going to snowball as time goes by. And when I started, there were a few sites who were talking about it incidentally, but nobody was talking about it systematically. And just in the past few months, there's been like another couple. There's been like a podcast that started up and another website that's looking at issues purely for visually impaired players. So it seems like it's starting to gain a little bit of traction as time goes by. And that's the most encouraging thing, because if there's a lot of people talking about it and a lot of people are making this explicitly a business case, like, I will not buy a game if it's not accessible to me, people basically have to listen, because as soon as the wallet comes into it, that's what the most convincing argument is.
Yeah, I'm not going to spend my £120 on your game.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent. This has been fascinating. I'm afraid we're at the end of our half hour, but we will continue our discussions on Twitter. And I think it's going to be a really great Twitter chat. So we really look forward to joining you on Tuesday. Need to thank our supporters, Barclays and My ClearText, for helping keep AXSChat going over the years. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Please, everybody, check out Meeple Like Us. If you want to go and play some new board games, I'm feeling the urge to get all sulky with my wife and let her beat me at a board game now. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you very
really
much,
good talking to you.
Amazing.
Thank you.